Look to the south, and you who went with me through the land can best say if they too have not been fearfully punished. Mourning in every household, desolation written in broad characters across the whole face of their country, cities in ashes and fields laid waste, their commerce gone, their system of labor annihilated and destroyed. Ruin, poverty, and stack of miseries. William Tecumseh Sherman.
When Lee finally surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the war between the states had lasted more than 4 years and cost $20 billion. 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The South lay in ruins. Driven by hunger and starvation, people wandered the countryside in search of jobs that didn't exist. Now a new challenge faced the nation: how to restore the southern states to the Union. Who would decide the terms under which they would be readmitted? Should the former rebels be forgiven or punished? And what should be the fate of the freedmen, the close to 3.5 million African-American men, women, and children released from bondage? There was no blueprint to follow, no agreement about who could or should make these decisions. Reconstruction of the American South would last for more than a decade. An era of grand visions and failed experiments, it would witness enormous economic and political changes, add 3 new amendments to the Constitution, and shape American race relations for a century to come. It would also become a subject of tremendous controversy from that day to this. By 1863, much blood had already been spilled in the farmlands and small towns throughout the land. Congress had also become a battlefield, with congressmen fighting over how to put the nation back together, while their relatives slaughtered each other in an escalating civil war. President Lincoln tried to stop the fighting by offering the South a compromise. He proposed that only 10% of Southern voters need petition for readmittance to the Union to be welcomed back. Too lenient, said Congress, which insisted on stricter terms.
The federal government should revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure will have been spent in vain. Thaddeus Stevens, Pennsylvania Congressman.
We will never know if Lincoln could have worked with Congress on a unified policy for Reconstruction of the Southern states. On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, an unstable actor sympathetic to the Confederate cause, assassinated Lincoln at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Millions mourned as a funeral train carried the martyred president's body back to Illinois. With Lincoln's tragic death, the fate of the former Confederate states fell into the hands of new President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, who had 8 months to bring about readmittance of the Southern states before Congress reconvened. Back in 1861, Andy Johnson had been the only Southern member of Congress to oppose secession. Once a poor tailor, Johnson had hated the old slave aristocracy of the South. But the president was quick to pardon prominent Confederates and return their property. Within a few months, the former Confederate states had ratified the 13th Amendment and met enough of Johnson's terms to rejoin the Union and to send their newly elected representatives to the new 39th Congress. And then all hell broke loose. The South had elected 4 Confederate generals, 58 members of the Confederate Congress, 6 of Jefferson Davis's cabinet officers, and Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, all former secessionists, unrepentant and unreconstructed. What's more, the new Southern legislatures had passed laws called black codes, which came close to recreating slavery in all but name.
Northern Republican legislators were very displeased by what had happened. And that was understandable when you think about it, simply because they had been engaged in a war for 4 years in which hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost, merely to turn around now to see the people who had been responsible return to power. And so the Republican-controlled Congress refused to seat such persons, immediately created a joint committee on Reconstruction to investigate the situation in the South, to embark upon a new policy that would begin to create some guarantees that the former slave population would at least be granted at least some minimal rights so that their newly won freedom would have some actual substance.
Claiming that this was the work of radicals out to destroy the Union, Johnson vetoed the legislation, and the battle was on. The heart of the Congress's plan was a new 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
The 14th Amendment is one of the most complex amendments in the U.S. Constitution. It was a grab bag amendment that was an attempt by Northerners, by Republicans, to solve all the constitutional and political problems they were having with Reconstruction in one shot.
So it was to establish citizenship rights for the former slaves and for free blacks that had been living here for years. It was to give legal equality to all of these persons, but also to give due process rights and equal treatment before the law to anyone, even if they weren't a citizen. And so the 14th Amendment proves to be a very important amendment to the Constitution.
In the future, this amendment, popularly known as the Equal Rights Amendment, would become one of the most important, protecting the rights not only of African Americans, but also of women, the elderly, people with disabilities, and others. But at the time it was proposed, the 14th Amendment was a blow to two of the most sacred principles of Southern politics: states' rights and the belief in Negro inferiority.
Equality does not exist between whites and blacks. The one race is by nature inferior in many respects, physically and mentally, to the other. Alexander Stephens.
The Southern states that had been in the Confederacy did not like this one bit, because they did not want their former slaves to have political power.
The Southern states rejected the amendment. Rallying to their cause, President Johnson hit the campaign trail, haranguing voters to throw the Republicans out of office. But the voters sided with the Republicans, not Johnson.
Back in Congress, they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which reimposed military law, dividing the South into 5 military districts. Readmittance to the Union now would require ratification of the 14th Amendment, black political participation in the elections for state constitutional conventions that would then set up new state governments, and congressional approval of their new state constitutions. Radical Reconstruction had begun.
Johnson and Congress were in a street fight, going at each other tooth and nail. When the president dismissed Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton against Congress's wishes, the House of Representatives, in a move unprecedented in American history, initiated impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States for high crimes and misdemeanors.
The Senate trial dragged on for 11 weeks. When it was over, Johnson had escaped conviction by only a single vote. That November, the American people elected war hero Ulysses S. Grant as the 18th President of the United States. Black voters helped put Grant over the top.
The Republicans didn't have enough white support in the South to build Republican parties. So they looked to black votes to build Republican parties so that the Democratic Party wouldn't take over. And what they needed to do was to protect black ballots, and the best way to protect black ballots was through a constitutional amendment.
To make sure that Southern whites didn't take the vote away from black men, the the Republicans wrote a 15th Amendment for the Constitution, which forbade states to deny the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous servitude.
It allowed African Americans to participate in American society on an equal basis for the first time. And this was radical to many whites because the thought was, hey, these people are not equal to us.
It did something else. It also clearly did not include women. And women were angry with the 15th Amendment.
I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand a ballot for the Negro and not the woman. Susan B. Anthony.
Female abolitionists felt the time had come for their rights to be recognized too.
Women had been one of the two pillars of the anti-slavery movement from the 1830s on. They had helped in reform movements, they had helped win the war, and the choice was made by Republicans, saying that black suffrage was enough to make many white voters angry. Women's suffrage added on to that would be too much, and both would lose. So we're going to have to choose which one we want. In the short run, they thought it more important that blacks be protected than that women be protected in the ballot.
In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association to get a 16th Amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee women the right to vote. But Reconstruction's focus would remain on race, not gender, and the major battlegrounds remained in the South, where more than 90% of all African Americans still lived.
When freedom come, folks left home, out in the streets crying, praying, singing, shouting, yelling, and knocking down everything.
We knew freedom was on us, but we didn't know what was to come with it. We thought we was going to be rich, richer than the white folks, because we were stronger. But it didn't turn out that way. We soon found out that freedom could make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich.
So long as the shadow of the great house falls across you, you ain't gonna feel like no free man, and you aren't gonna feel like no free woman. You must all move. You must move clear away from the old places that you know.
When the war was over, the freedmen, the newly emancipated blacks, did things you would expect them. They tried to define freedom. They tested freedom by doing things that they couldn't do as slaves. As a slave, if you wanted to move around, you had to ask the master permission, get a written pass and what have you. It could be denied, and often was. You moved around. You simply walked around to see what it was like to be free. But it wasn't aimless walking. It was walking to reunite with family members who might have been sold away during slavery time, or you'd been separated during the war because of all the upheavals with armies tramping about and invasions occurring and you fleeing bondage or some other member of your family fleeing bondage, so you tried to reunite your families. You would go off and try to establish your own churches. One of the first things that blacks did, this is extremely important, is they self-separated from white churches. They weren't driven out. They understood that religion was important and they wanted to define it in their own terms.
So many people on the move created problems, especially when they started off with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and when hunger and want was everywhere. What should be done to help them? How much independence should they be permitted? How many of the rights of citizenship should they be granted? The old rules of slavery didn't apply anymore, but the new rules of freedom were not clear either. The South's desire to reimpose slavery in all but name had convinced Congress to help the freedmen. During Reconstruction, the federal government would try what no other former slaveholding nation has ever tried, to protect and assist a people that had for centuries been held in bondage. To establish some order among the hundreds of private relief organizations already providing relief, Congress in 1865 set up the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. During the years it operated, the Freedmen's Bureau, as it was known, became a government unto itself, providing emergency food and medical services to refugees of both races, managing confiscated and abandoned lands, negotiating contracts between black workers and white landowners, and running its own courts.
the vast majority of African Americans in the South, 9 out of 10 people, had been enslaved, which meant that they owned nothing, and they had earned nothing for their work. They had made no wages for all the work they had done. And the second thing was that in most Southern states, it had been illegal to teach slaves or black people to read and write. So they also did not have the means to make themselves into what we think of as middle-class people because they had no education. They also had no land. So one fundamental issue facing the nation that the Freedmen's Bureau tried to adjust with only partial success was the economic transformation of people with nothing.
The Bureau's greatest success came in the area of education. The freedmen realized that education was the road to independence and progress. Spurred by articles written by wartime volunteers, thousands of teachers, both black and white, poured into the South. They taught everywhere, in barns, one-room shacks, open fields. By 1869, more than 9,000 teachers working for the Freedmen's Bureau were teaching close to 250,000 students and running more than 4,000 schools. Black churches joined the Bureau in organizing black high schools and colleges that would train the coming generations of black educators, political leaders, and professionals. By 1871, all ex-Confederate states had been restored to the Union. Now the task of reconstructing the South could begin in earnest, led by new state governments, dominated not by the old slaveholding Democrats, but by Republicans, made up of Northern newcomers, Southern liberals, and free blacks. The Republican state governments did remarkably well under very difficult circumstances. They repealed the black codes, permitted all men to vote, eliminated imprisonment for debt, allowed women to own property, established hospitals and asylums for orphans and the insane, created a system of free public education, helped rebuild the South's transportation system and economy, and created the most democratic governments the South had ever known. But white Southerners hated the Republican government from the start.
For a period of time, white men and black men tried to work together in political parties. But steadily, the conservative Democrats and those who did not like blacks being part of the new political system, and the shame, so to speak, that a white person would even cooperate with this.
Let not your pride nor yet your pretended friends flatter you into the belief that you ever can or will for any length of time govern the white men of the South. The world has never seen such a spectacle. Your present power must surely and soon pass from you.
During Reconstruction and for decades to come, white Southerners would cry that, protected by the U.S. Army, the Republican state governments had done more damage to the South than the Civil War itself.
It seemed like forever, and they stole us blind. The carpetbaggers and the Negroes, and some of our own folks, too. Filthy scalawags, and those uppity colored people running things to suit themselves.
That's the story that generations of children were told, by school teachers, by older relatives, that bitter Yankees, raising former slaves to a status for which they were utterly unprepared and mentally incompetent, was the fatal error of national policy after the Civil War. But was any of this actually true? African Americans never controlled even a single Southern state government. Whites always held the upper hand. Corruption there was, and some of it was quite bad. But this was hardly unique to the South and was on a small scale compared to the graft that nearly toppled the Grant administration, or compared to the millions that Boss Tweed's Tammany Hall ring was raking in New York City. Black incompetence, too, was a weak claim. The 2,000 black men who held public office between 1865 and 1877 proved to be no worse, and in many cases, a good deal better than their white counterparts. Black officials also came from remarkably diverse backgrounds, and some were extremely well educated. Politicians like U.S. Senators Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce of Mississippi served their constituents with honesty and distinction. What really made Republican rule so offensive to conservative whites were the new taxes passed to fund the internal improvements, and the fact that the Republicans were outsiders and African Americans. Scandalmongers spread false and exaggerated stories of Negro rule and corruption to legitimize the campaigns of terror that swept the Republican officials from office.
Since the year 1866, nearly 3,500 persons, a great majority of whom were colored men, have been killed and wounded in this state on account of their political sentiments. General Philip Sheridan, New Orleans, January 1875.
Fanning fears of Negro domination, white Democrats calling themselves the Redeemers teamed up with white terrorist organizations like the infamous Ku Klux Klan and White League to recapture the South. The campaign of terror raged for years. Black officials were beaten, murdered, driven from their homes, threatened, or assaulted. The Klan went after men and women, old people and children, school teachers, farmers, businessmen, and white supporters of black rights. The federal government finally struck back, passing the Force Acts of 1870 and the KKK Act of 1871, which gave President Grant unprecedented powers to use the armed forces to crack down on the white terrorist organizations. Enforcement was vigorous, but too late, for by then the so-called Redeemers had taken control of the South. By the early 1870s, the nation had grown tired of Reconstruction, and the American people called for its end. Prominent newspaper publisher turned presidential candidate Horace Greeley, a strong supporter of radical Reconstruction only a few years before, declared it was time to have done with Reconstruction. The country is sick of it. In fact, one of the reasons the North was so willing to give up on Reconstruction was because it had never really taken racial equality to heart. Many Republicans in the North wanted rights for Southern blacks because they wanted the freedmen to stay where they were. To add to the growing racial tension, black men began to compete for the same jobs as white men and began to suffer from discrimination in jobs and housing. Even after black men were guaranteed the right to vote in all Southern states, they could vote in only 6 states in the North. Most white Americans looked with suspicion and fear on those whose skin was a different color.
The real trouble is that we hate the Negro. It is not his ignorance that offends us, but his color. George W. Julian, Indiana.
In 1876, the nation was in the midst of the worst depression in American history. Focusing on political corruption and economic recovery, the presidential election between Democrat Samuel J. Tilden and Republican Rutherford B. Hayes went down to the wire.
When the election returns finally come in, Tilden has won the popular vote, and all he needs is 1 electoral vote to be elected president. Unfortunately, 4 states send in disputed returns. The Democrats concede Oregon, the Republicans concede Florida. That still leaves 2 sets of probably both fraudulent electoral returns from Louisiana and South Carolina. 1 set going to Hayes, 1 set going to Tilden. The election is going to be decided by Congress. Unfortunately, Congress is controlled by the Democrats, the Senate is controlled by the Republicans, so we've got a deadlock there. So they set up a special electoral commission to decide the election. After some finagling and informal deals, the commission finally throws the election to Hayes, who needed all of those disputed votes to be elected president. In what becomes known as the Great Compromise of 1877 then, the Democrats concede the White House to Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Republicans agree to withdraw the last remaining federal troops from the South. In April of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes withdraws the last remaining federal troops from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, officially ending the great experiment in Reconstruction of the American South.
Though the troops were gone, an elaborate series of federal laws and constitutional amendments still protected the rights of African Americans. But in the coming decades, those rights and protections would be steadily eroded. Slavery may have ended, but in its place emerged what some historians have called a racial caste system. That is, a system of racial segregation and subordination, in which your place in society was fixed at birth by your race. Before the Civil War, King Cotton ruled. The American South grew 3/4 of all the world's cotton. It was cotton that had made the South rich, cotton that employed 3/4 of all slaves, cotton that had been the nation's greatest source of money from abroad. Financing the Civil War had left the nation deep in debt. When the war was over, there was a quick and sure way to pay off the national debt and get the Southern economy back on its feet. The answer was to restore the great plantations to their original owners and get the cotton back in the soil. But the 13th Amendment had ended slavery. So how would they grow it? The freedmen had no intention of going back to work in gangs under white foremen, and whites had no cash to pay wages. So they worked out a new labor system called sharecropping, based on credit. The deal was that the landowner would provide the land and supplies. The black farmers would grow the cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops, and at the end of the season, when the crops came in, they would settle up accounts and split the profit.
But there were problems that attended the system of sharecropping because the items that the landowner had made available to them on a loan basis were made available at very high interest rates. And if they did not come up with a harvest that was large enough, they went into the next year indebted. And that could be compounded by the fact that we're talking about sharecroppers who were by and large illiterate, but the books were kept by people who were more literate than them and the people who employed them. And that provided an opportunity for their further exploitation. So the end result was a system now that kept people constantly in debt and literally tied to the land.
Continually in debt, many Southern sharecroppers lived in conditions little better than slavery. A Southern Homestead Act passed in 1866 did enable a few thousand freedmen to get land, but this was only a drop in the bucket. And so back into bondage, many did indeed fall. In the decades following Reconstruction, the South systematically whittled away at the laws protecting the African Americans' rights. Southern whites ignored existing laws, then passed new Jim Crow laws that separated the races and forbade blacks from using schools, hotels, libraries, beaches, bathrooms, water fountains, the whole range of public life.
Segregation is simply the separation of the races. Generally, it is by the dominant group, the group that is in power. It can be based on the fact that they feel they are superior to one race, and it can assume really ludicrous proportions. In the United States, for instance, if you look at some of the old laws for segregation, there were laws that forbade blacks and whites who worked in the same building from looking out the same window. There were laws that said they could not use the same school books. But it was a very serious problem because after the Civil War, when blacks were freed, they weren't not given all the rights of citizenship. It was shortly after that that you have segregation beginning. And what segregation did was impose upon blacks who were already at the bottom.
To control their black neighbors, whites continued to use violence and intimidation, and the terror of choice was lynchings. By the early 1890s, white vigilantes killed more than 200 people a year for crimes real or imagined. Campaigns to strip black men of their right to vote were completed that same decade. Federal courts also hindered African Americans by chipping away at their constitutional protections. In the 1880s, a federal court ruled that those doing the segregating did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as they provided equal accommodations and services for blacks. When the Supreme Court upheld this notion of separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, segregation won constitutional sanction. In the coming decades, Southern states and municipalities would pass laws to create two societies, separate and unequal, that would remain on the books until the 1960s. Surveying the American racial landscape soon after the turn of the century, W.E.B. Du Bois would write,
"For this much all men know, despite compromise, war, and struggle, the Negro is not free. In the backwoods of the Gulf states, for miles and miles, he may not leave the plantation of his birth. In well nigh the whole rural South, the black farmers are peons, bound by law and custom to an economic slavery, from which the only escape is death or the penitentiary. In the most cultured sections and cities of the South, the Negroes are a segregated servile class with restricted rights and privileges. Before the courts, both in law and custom, they stand on a different and peculiar basis. Taxation without representation is the rule of their political life. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of race."
Reconstruction was perhaps the most democratic, most revolutionary period in American history, in that one of the things that Reconstruction did was give all men the right to vote. The second thing was that we got public education throughout the South as a result of Reconstruction. Then, of course, the third thing that occurs in the South during Reconstruction is that you get a new level of civil rights. So Reconstruction, and in my view, was one of the most democratic periods in American history. And it's just unfortunate that it only lasted from 1866 to 1877.
So it was a failed opportunity if you could have had the political will in 1865 and 1866 to demand more of white Southerners, that they accept their defeat, and part of the acceptance of that defeat would be a willingness to grant to their citizens among them, black citizens, an opportunity to get ahead economically and political rights so they can protect economic opportunity. That didn't happen. One of the things that did happen that is extremely important later on were the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments, that in effect provided the constitutional groundwork for claims for full citizenship that would be made in the 20th century and most vigorously after World War II in the modern civil rights movement.
Swept up in a period of unprecedented expansion and economic growth, Americans following Reconstruction dismissed the fate of African Americans as a Southern problem, best handled by the people who lived there. Attention now turned to America's bright future, which lay in the mines and fields of the American West, in the teeming immigrant neighborhoods and factories of the nation's booming industrial cities.
Look to the south, and you who went with me through the land can best say if they too have not been fearfully punished. Mourning in every household, desolation written in broad characters across the whole face of their country, cities in ashes and fields laid waste, their commerce gone, their system of labor annihilated and destroyed. Ruin, poverty, and stack of miseries. William Tecumseh Sherman.
When Lee finally surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the war between the states had lasted more than 4 years and cost $20 billion. 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The South lay in ruins. Driven by hunger and starvation, people wandered back to Illinois. With Lincoln's tragic death, the fate of the former Confederate states fell into the hands of new President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, who had 8 months to bring about readmittance of the Southern states before Congress reconvened. Back in 1861, Andy Johnson had been the only Southern member of Congress to oppose secession. Once a poor tailor, Johnson had hated the old slave aristocracy of the South. But the president was quick to pardon prominent Confederates and return their property. Within a few months, the former Confederate states had ratified the 13th Amendment and met enough of Johnson's terms to rejoin the Union and to send their newly elected representatives to the new 39th Congress. And then all hell broke loose. The South had 11% of Southern voters need petition for readmittance to the Union to be welcomed back. Too lenient, said Congress, which insisted on stricter terms.
The federal government should revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure will have been spent in vain. Thaddeus Stevens, Pennsylvania Congressman.
We will never know if Lincoln could have worked with Congress on a unified policy for Reconstruction of the Southern states. On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, an unstable actor sympathetic to the Confederate cause, assassinated Lincoln at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Millions mourned as a funeral train carried the martyred president's body to the Constitution and shape American race relations for a century to come. It would also become a subject of tremendous controversy from that day to this. By 1863, much blood had already been spilt in the farmlands and small towns throughout the land. Congress had also become a battlefield, with congressmen fighting over how to put the nation back together, while their relatives slaughtered each other in an escalating civil war. President Lincoln tried to stop the fighting by offering the South a compromise. He proposed that only 10% of the countryside in search of jobs that didn't exist. Now a new challenge faced the nation: how to restore the Southern states to the Union. Who would decide the terms under which they would be readmitted? Should the former rebels be forgiven or punished? And what should be the fate of the freedmen, the close to 3.5 million African-American men, women, and children released from bondage? There was no blueprint to follow, no agreement about who could or should make these decisions. Reconstruction of the American South would last for more than a decade. An era of grand visions and failed experiments, it would witness enormous economic and political changes, add 3 new amendments to the Constitution,